Welcome to this episode of Educont on Plato, part of our philosophy series. All right, so let's dive in. We're talking about Plato, who was around from about 425 to 347 BCE. And here's a fun fact right off the bat. Plato probably wasn't even his real name. It was likely a nickname. See, he came from this super wealthy, aristocratic family, and his given name was probably Aristocles. Plato actually means broad in Greek, so was it a nickname from his wrestling coach because he was this big, sturdy guy, or was it from his admirers talking about the incredible breadth of his mind? We don't know for sure, but it's a cool little detail, right?
But look, to really get Plato, you have to start with a tragedy. A single event that completely defined his life's work. It all boils down to one haunting question. Why would a city, the city, Athens, the cradle of democracy, execute its wisest man? We're talking about Socrates, of course. And this single terrible act, well, it pretty much set the stage for all of Western philosophy.
So you gotta picture the scene. The Athens Plato grew up in was, well, it was a mess, a total pressure cooker. They had just lost this absolutely devastating war to their rival, Sparta. Politically, it was chaos. You had this passion-fueled democracy constantly clashing with a super wealthy, powerful elite. And on top of all that, intellectually, everything was being torn apart. You had these thinkers called the sophists who were questioning everything. Every religious belief, every political tradition, nothing was certain anymore. It was a place where, as one historian so perfectly put it, traditions and dogmas rub one another down. Basically a city in complete turmoil.
And right into the middle of all this chaos walks Socrates. Now, he wasn't what you'd call a looker, and he definitely wasn't rich. He was just this kind of awkward guy who'd wander around the marketplace, buttonholing the most powerful people in the city. And he'd hit them with these seemingly simple questions, like, hey, what is justice really? Or what does it mean to be virtuous? He was the city's gadfly, constantly buzzing around, stinging the establishment, demanding that they actually think about the words they used, and, most importantly, that they know thyself. And this leads to his most famous line, right? One thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing. Now, this isn't him just being falsely modest, not at all. This was the absolute core of his philosophy. His whole method started with doubt, questioning everything, especially the things powerful people held to be true. And what he did, over and over, was show that the folks who claimed to be the wisest, well, they often didn't know what they were talking about. And as you can probably guess, that did not win him a lot of friends in high places. So yeah, eventually they brought charges against him. The official rap sheet, corrupting the youth and not believing in the city's gods. But let's be real, the political subtext was huge. He was seen as a major threat. Think about it. Some of his students were guys like Critias, who happened to be Plato's uncle, and Critias had just led this incredibly violent anti-democratic takeover. So when democracy was restored, they looked at Socrates, the teacher of these revolutionaries, and saw a massive danger.
And Plato was there. He wrote down what happened in his teacher's final moments, and it is just heartbreaking. Even the jailer, the guy who had to give him the poison, was apparently in tears, saying Socrates was the noblest and gentlest and best man he'd ever met. And Socrates himself? Completely calm. He had chances to escape, but he refused. He just kept talking about philosophy, right up until the very last second. Can you imagine? Plato was only 28 years old. He watched the state, his state, kill the man he considered the wisest, the justest, and best person he'd ever known. This one event just shattered him. It filled him with this deep, burning contempt for democracy, which he now saw as just chaotic mob rule. And right then and there, his life's mission was set.
He basically spent the rest of his life obsessed with answering one single, all-consuming question. How do you build a city, a government that's so well-designed, so just, that it would never kill its best minds? How do you make sure a tragedy like what happened to Socrates could never, ever happen again?
And his answer was the Republic. But don't think of it as just a book. No way! It's a blueprint, a radical, incredibly detailed plan for a perfect society. It's an ideal state, completely engineered from the ground up, to make sure that wisdom and justice are in charge, not raw emotion and political games.
Okay, so here's his big idea. Plato argued that a just state is basically a just person writ large, like the human soul scaled up. He believed our soul has three parts. You've got desire, or appetite, at the bottom. That's all our wants and cravings. Then there's spirit, in the middle. That's our courage, our emotions, our fight. And at the very top, you have reason, the logical thinking part. So for a state to be just, it has to have the same structure. The producers, the workers, the farmers, are driven by appetite, and they provide everything the city needs.
The auxiliaries, the soldiers, are driven by spirit, and they protect the city. And the guardians, well, they are guided by pure reason, and they are the ones who have to rule.
And this structure leads directly to his massive critique of government. For Plato, the Athenian democracy he knew was a total disaster. He called it an incompetent sham. Why? Because you have uninformed people picking rulers based on who's the best speaker or who's the most flattering, and that, he said, always leads to chaos and tyranny. His alternative? He called it an aristocracy. But hold on, he didn't mean rule by the rich or the blue-blooded, not at all. He meant an aristocracy of merit, the rule by the best, the smartest, most virtuous people, who would be handpicked after decades and decades of intense training.
And this brings us to the absolute heart of his whole political theory, the Philosopher King. He famously said that cities will never be free from trouble until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy. He was completely convinced that society's problems would just go on and on forever unless the people who are the wisest, the philosophers, are also the people who are in charge. For him, true justice is only possible when power and wisdom are the exact same thing.
Okay, so that's the big idea. But it raises a huge question, right? How does a ruler get that wise in the first place? Where does this true knowledge even come from? For Plato, the answer is found in maybe the most famous story in all of philosophy. To become wise, you have to escape the cave.
Here's how it goes. Imagine all of us are prisoners. We've been chained up since we were born deep inside a dark cave, and we can only look forward at a flat wall. Now behind us there's a fire, and between us and the fire, people are walking by, holding up puppets and objects, and the fire casts shadows onto the wall in front of us. For us prisoners, those shadows are everything. That's our whole reality. The philosopher, according to Plato, is the one person who manages to break their chains, turn around and see the fire and the real objects for the first time. And then they have to make the difficult climb out of the cave and into the real world, into the blinding light of the sun.
So this whole story isn't just a story. It's his explanation of reality itself. Plato believed there are two realms. The cave, that's the world we see and touch with our senses. He called it the realm of becoming. It's a world of shadows, filled with imperfect, temporary copies of things. But outside the cave, that's the realm of being. That's true reality. It's a higher plane where the perfect, eternal, unchanging forms or ideas exist. We're talking about the perfect form of a circle, the true essence of justice itself, the perfect form of beauty.
So the philosopher's whole journey is to learn to see these perfect forms, not with their eyes, but with their mind, with their intellect. And the final destination, the ultimate goal, which is represented by the sun in the story, is to grasp the highest form of all, the form of the good. And Plato's point is this: only a ruler who has seen and understood this ultimate good can possibly know what true justice is and therefore rule a city the right way.
You know, it's almost impossible to overstate Plato's impact. I mean, it is just massive. In 387 BCE, he founded his own school, the Academy, which basically became the template for every university in the Western world. His ideas about an eternal soul and a higher, more perfect reality, they profoundly shaped Christian theology for more than a millennium. And honestly, today, the big questions he was asking, what is justice? What is knowledge? How should we live? Are still the central questions we're all grappling with.
There's this famous quote from the 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He said that all of European philosophy is really just a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it gets at a really deep truth. Plato was pretty much the first person to systematically tackle almost all the big questions that have defined philosophy for the last 2,500 years.
And that leaves us with his challenge, doesn't it? A provocative one for sure. Plato's Republic offers this powerful and, let's admit it, kind of unsettling vision for a perfect society. It forces us to ask some really tough questions. Should the wise be the ones to rule? And if we say yes, then comes the hardest question of all. In our world, today, who gets to decide who the wise ones really are?